So a little bit of background. Uh, in 2017, not only did I start my own business, I also started to do some voluntary work around creating sound walks around the city. I can't believe it's nearly 10 years. And it was using and contributing to a global research project called Hush City. And it was a very interesting project in my mind because instead of just looking at a number, a decibel, it was looking at it as a more qualitative approach. So, what do we mean by quiet? What do we mean by sound? The impacts of noise. We collected over, I think it was a 3 or 4 year period, close to 150 sound walks. Now the figure for Bristol is nearer 300 or 400, and it's the highest amount of any global city in that's been collected as part of this program. It's run by Antonella Radici, who's based now at University of Siena, and it's still going on. But there is a reason for this, and that is because noise pollution is the second biggest environmental health issue in Western Europe after air pollution, and people are not sometimes just not aware of this. And that's a big implication in terms of health. It's implications around fatigue, burnout, etc. But also there are other issues around it, which is to do with economy. It's also relationship to biodiversity, healthcare costs, etc. So it has some really large implications. Also, just on top of that, because this project is focusing on involving people with neurodivergent individuals, over 80% of neurodivergent individuals actively avoid certain public spaces due to sensory needs. So we have an issue. Ooh, sorry. So just to put this point across, one of the things also linked around quiet spaces is around the need for, well, okay, here we have noise. One of the big factors of noise pollution is traffic, low emitting sounds such as mechanical ventilation units, etc. But what counters that is also equally of importance. And so things like green spaces, bird song can actually have very positive mental health and well-being aspects that have a well researched outcomes as well. So it's an interesting counteractive between what you hear, but also to enable birdsong to happen, you need the quiet, but you also need the habitats for them to exist. So I'm going to put this in terms of local perspective of Bristol, and a couple of things to be aware of. So in Bristol, interestingly, in terms of disability, only 38% of people in Bristol visit parks who are disabled. Also, there are some really big barriers, though, as particularly urban spaces in Bristol, with research that was published earlier this year, where 90% of residents live within 350 meters of green space, but this does not mean it's usable. And this is a big question about quality and also about how something is inclusive and what do we mean by accessibility, etc. as well. Although Bristol is thought to be the third greenest city in the UK. So this is a very interesting point in terms of looking at the detail. On that survey, also, they did an evaluation because they have green spaces, mapping, etc. And the evaluation they came out was only under 70% of the city comprised of publicly accessible open spaces. That's quite enormous when you think about it in terms of, hey, we may be a great green city, but only under 70% is actually accessible. We've got an issue. On top of that, because we're not just looking about accessibility and quiet space, we're also looking at, with this project, about cool spaces. And at the moment, Bristol City Centre has a relatively low tree canopy cover. And tree canopy cover, just to explain, is if you were a bird looking in the sky and you look down on the trees, it's the total area of that tree. So for an example, how broad its canopy is looking down from bird's eye looking down. So at the moment it's under 10%, comparative to the rest of the city, which is 15 to 18. And tree canopy cover is a massive indicator in terms of urban heat island effect. So this is also linked to another project that was completed a couple of years ago, which is Keep Bristol Cool, which contribute part of it to, which was basically evaluating about where are the hottest places and how we're going to counter that. So at the moment, just to put an example, is a 12 Celsius degrees higher in the centre than outside, which is significant when you think about it from health and well-being, etc. perspective. So back to the project. So when we first started looking at this project, we collected all the data, and I just thought, well, what are we going to do with all this data? I mean, like, data is data, but how are you going to apply it? How are you going to use it? So started to define what we meant by specific aspects within the project. So accessibility, for example, can mean very different to different people in different applications. So the definition on this one is around specifically the physical but audio sensory barriers. And you can see the others I've defined here as well. So for example, quiet space is also about whether you can hear natural sounds and creating a calm, restorative place. These are quite important as definitions. As I say, there is variability, etc., with different projects and different applications. So we started to compile various team members within the project. It was very important. I felt that we had a very clear output that is going to be something that is usable and publicly accessible at the end of it. So I am Sarah Jones-Morris. Jamie Liversedge, who's also at the University of Gloucestershire, is the academic mentor. I can't remember, the principal investigator, because although I am with the University of Gloucestershire, as Katerina said before, I'm actually primarily practice, but I'm as my friend calls, a practitioner. We also use data though, and this is very important. Although we are contributing and using Hush City, which is an app and a global citizen science project, as the qualitative soundscape data aspect, we are also looking at wider available open data from Bristol City Council, and we also have partnered with Tranquil City, who are a consultancy who've developed also some really fantastic data sets around well-being, etc., which they very kindly provided for us on this project. We also have an advisory group, which is Dr. Antonella Radici, who leads the Hush City program in Italy. We have Zoe Banks-Gross, Dan Pope, who I think is in the call, who's an acoustician, and James Musioki, who's also an acoustician. We also have some other partners, yes, quite a few. We have place changers who are going to be supplying the geoinformation space, GIS, Geographic Information Systems outputs, which I'll talk about a bit later. Savannah Vise, who is doing graphics, and we've got Visit West, and these guys are really, really important. Visit West is the tourist board for the Southwest area. They are going to be hosting the website where the Bristol Quiet Areas Plan is going to be hosted. And also our fantastic partners, Wessel Disability Inc., who have been leading, and they are the ones who've been facilitating the engagement aspect, specifically with their group that they have devised and created for participants. So just to summarize what we're doing in short form, we have the sound walks, we have the data, we have a series of co-creation workshops, which I'll be talking about a bit further along. The output, i.e. what's going to be the deliverable at the end of it, is a website hosted by Visit West as part of their accessibility hub, but we also have GIS information that we will be supplying to Bristol City Council on the Know Your Place websites. We already have all these various agreements set up, which is great because it basically means there'll be an immediate output straight away from this. So one of the things with this particular project's been very interesting is that one aspect was how we use artificial intelligence. And it's actually a requirement of this project to use AI, which is quite interesting. Not always the case, I would say, but we had to go through quite a stringent review with it, the ethics committee, about how we use AI. So there's specific elements that we can't use and specific elements that we can. I would say that on this particular project, if I didn't use AI, it would be an incredibly labor-intensive, administratively hungry process. That's to do with a number of things, but a lot of it's to do with administration. So one of the things we've developed is the use of agents, and I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about this, but basically they're kind of like a critical friend. So we have an agent, for example, where we have uploaded all the information required around guidance documentation nationally about the application, etc., to check that what we are doing is fulfilling the requirements not only of the application, but also fulfilling guidance. So, for example, we have a website, we had a workshop last week about how specific elements of the website should be designed in a specific way, which is fantastic from those user participants' perspective. But we also have to sense check it against national guidance as well, because there is some really great guidance around specifically autism and how websites are designed. So that's just to give an example. So our objectives essentially is to refine methods to map quiet urban spaces, and specifically the focus on Bristol City Council, because we have quite a lot of information and already data, as I discussed earlier. So how do we refine that further? We also want to make it a transferable framework, because although we are focusing on Bristol as a pilot, bear in mind this is the first time a Quiet Areas Plan has ever been developed, particularly for outdoor spaces. It would be great to make it transferred and applicable to other cities and spaces. And then the other aspect is that we co-produce. And this is a very important aspect in terms of giving ownership and sense of agency to the participants involved, that we are not just doing something and we are the experts. They are the experts. How they're informing it is really important and gives value to the project and the output. So I think this is where things like, for example, accessibility digitally as well as physically is an important aspect, but also multiple format outputs. And that is why we have the website on Visit West, but we also have the GIS data sets as well for Bristol City Council. So this citizen science approach is an iterative hybrid approach. We are co-designing with Neurodivergent participants and Disability Inc., who are WESL. They're the just short form is WESL is the charity, Disability Inc. is their consultancy element of that. We are combining the lived experience and environmental data. I'll touch upon that in a minute about what that has an impact on. We also have a hybrid approach to this. Not everybody is comfortable with digital support. Some people are, some people aren't, but also what we found that paper first, particularly with participants, has been much more welcomed, shall we say. Also testing methods through the soundworks, but we must have an element of flexibility and responsive rather than fixed methodologies with this, because of the nature of the participants we're working with too, but also just because we have quite a few different limitations with partnerships technologically as well. And also what's been interesting is the accessibility as part of ethics and is not an add-on. In other words, this is actually a key driver for our project, and I'll give an example of that. When we supplied our participant information sheet for ethics, and I passed it on to Disability WESL to review, there was some majority was redlined. That doesn't make sense. That's too technical. Nobody's going to understand that. Too much information. So we had to strip information back really, really down to the essential components. It's exactly the same as what we had when we developed the survey, because the survey for the soundwalks, there is the digital app Hush City, but then to create a paper format of that at first was overly complicated. So again, we had to strip back the information quite considerably, which had a much more positive outcome. So very, very important that in terms of accessibility must be tested and challenged and adapted through lived experience. That's really, really important. Rigidity would not be appropriate for a project like this. So just to touch on the methodology in a bit more detail, we had a desktop data review, and that's data that was supplied from Tranquil City, Bristol City Council, and the previously surveyed sites that we had done through Bristol Soundwalks. We then selected the sites. We then, just quite recently, I think 8th of May? No, 24th of April, that we did the Soundwalks with the participants. Wessel also provided us with an accessibility audit of the 3 sites that have been selected. We had participant feedback, so those various components. We then have had a digital online initial review about how the website might be formed through examples. And now we've got an in-person workshop, which will be developing the prototype and map, and then there'll be a final testing and refinement before the launch. And I'll be talking through that program a bit later on. So all of that is to ensure that we co-create something that is understanding these various elements and outputs at the end. It's very important that we have these iterative feedback loops, and we have all this various data to co-create that element at the end. So with the site selections, I know the area very well, and because I've been doing the Hush City Soundwalks for such a long time, I knew there was going to be specific criteria that we need to look at, but also to ensure that we meet the objectives. We have to ensure that, first of all, it's within the city centre area, and that's to maximise impact. The other thing is that it's within accessible green infrastructure distance of 200 metres. Now, this is actually something that comes from Natural England in terms of accessible green space distances and walkability. It had already been defined as a quieter area, and that is through Hush City and the noise mapping in the Tranquil City Index. Nature rich, again, back to the data sets we already had included. Also, that it's located in an area of high heat vulnerability. That's linking to the Keep Bristol Cool. And also, it's an interesting one just about publicly accessible areas. That does not mean, just to reiterate, that the ownership is public, and there are lots of varying access conditions and ownerships within that. So just to briefly summarise in terms of the open data outcome, this map here, which hopefully you can see my cursor okay, these are the 3 sites. And this is the Tranquil City wellbeing data set. And you can see here that they're all within sort of green. I mean, it's quite, some of them are really tiny to look at, but they are all within essentially relatively high value areas. And this one in particular, which is Temple Church Garden, which is one of the sites which I'll be talking about in a sec. This here is the mapping from Natural England in terms of what it's defined as a green space, what its walkable distance area here. So the area here in the lighter blue is actually the 200 metres, which we're well within these sites. This site here with the pink and green is to do with management and ownership around for Bristol City Council in terms of their parks department. So it's just to say, for example, here, this is Temple Church Gardens, one of our sites, which is actually managed by Bristol City Council. But interesting, this is our other site that is not, that is under private ownership, but it is, and then you've got here, which is St Stephen's Church Garden, which is our other site as well. You can also see these areas are in slightly lighter colour here. This is the noise mapping from dataset from Tranquil City. And then here, these 3 sites just indicating where they are in relationship to heat vulnerability. They're either high or very high heat vulnerability areas in terms of keep Bristol cool. So these are our 3 sites. We have the St Stephen's Church Garden, which I'll explain a bit further what that looks like further on in the presentation. We have Temple Church Gardens, which is a much larger green site, and we have Millennium Promenade. They are within 50 metres of either a road or a bus stop in terms of accessibility, and they are known green spaces within the area. They have public access, they are pedestrianised. They're either known green spaces or they're visually green spaces. But the other thing about these 3 spaces is they are quite different, they're quite diverse. And the one thing that's an important aspect of that is that different people want different things from a green space or a quiet space. So that's why it's quite important to have that variety. For example, Millennium Promenade has not only got greenery and benches, it's also got the contact with water, while Temple Gardens is a much greener open space. And while this area, St Stephen's Church Garden, is a much smaller enclosed one. So they have that variety, and that's very important to sort of welcome people into and know that there are a variety of spaces available. So just when we started this process, that we already realised there were lessons learned before we even started doing the sound walks or anything else. And that is that the accessibility is always thought as this just a physical thing, and it's not. It's very much an emotional aspect as well. Also, the predictability does reduce stress, and visual preparation builds confidence in that predictability. Simple communication definitely outperforms complexity, and also is much more efficient. And back to this whole thing about how we must have this sort of more iterative process when it comes to participant-led information and projects. But also just to be aware that even during the early stages of the project, making people aware of where these green spaces are and what we're doing, it was already starting to create some quite meaningful impact, which I'll talk about a bit later on. But we do have a challenge of how we translate all that information and data into maps and pages and journey information, and from an insight to a usable output is quite a challenge. So we've got 3 sites, which is Temple Gardens, St Stephen's Church Gardens, and the Millennium Promenade. And those who may be familiar with Bristol may be familiar with these ones. There are challenges with all of them in terms of mobility. But interestingly, when Wessel completed their accessibility audit, Millennium Promenade was by far outshined as a performance from a mobility and accessibility point of view in terms of being clear and usable. Interestingly, our acousticians also did a short report as they measured through their equipment the decibel, and all the sites were above a World Health Organization guidance. But in terms of context, we're relatively quiet. So, and we had other sites that we looked at, but they were not as valued as an alternative for many reasons. So one of the things that even just from that accessibility audit, though, just as what I was saying about sort of even early stage impact, was that one of the participants who was part of that accessibility audit was so positively impacted by going to Millennium Promenade. She suddenly went, actually, I could come to Bristol and actually feel calm here, which is really important. So we have several sound walks that we did around these various church gardens, and this is St Stephen's Church that happened in April. And we had various insights. So we just produced this infographic recently just on the various insights that we've established so far already. So, for example, what defines these spaces quiet was a really big deliberation. Is it quiet or is it just less noisy? So, like, quiet doesn't always mean silence. A lot of the time, particularly in urban context, it's less noisy and you're more likely to hear the positive sounds. The other thing that came up was the fact that Natural England has accessible green space standard as a minimum of 200 metres, but those with mobility needs, it's 50 metres. That's a substantially smaller amount. And Active Travel England, if anyone's involved in development, etc., will know when it comes to disabled parking spaces and access, it's 50 metres too. So that's quite a big change in terms of when we're talking about inclusion and mobility needs. And just be aware that everybody at some stage will have a mobility need, whether it's temporary or permanent. It is very likely that is going to happen to your life at some point. Um, but there's also very important in terms of lived experiences about how people found as participants, that even it's not just about the site itself, it's about the journey to that site as well. So this is a really important aspect in terms of what we show as data and information on the website. But also it's all very well having these great nature-rich spaces, but they need to be accessible. So this is something that we are going through in terms of not just creating a map, but we are talking to partners about how maybe those sites could be improved in terms of accessibility. These are just a couple of quotes that we have from participants so far. There's many others. I have lots and lots of quotes. But it was a very much change of perceptions and perspectives of these various spaces. Some were familiar to others, some not. And then more recently, we've had a workshop about the website exploration, about what we actually have on our website, the graphics, what sort of information to have, what we shouldn't have. And that was really useful in terms of understanding what works for people. And we decided to be expedient, because remember, this is just a short project. It's 9 months and we have a limited budget. So we needed to search what other sensory mappings already being produced. So for example, Birmingham Museum Sensory Map, Culture City, which is in New York, and a couple of others we've used as examples that we've gone through with participants as part of a long online workshop to gain feedback about what they perceived as what works and what doesn't. And these are some of the insights. So for example, simple layouts. So for example, this map from Birmingham Museum was well received, but some other aspects that we have to be very careful about. And that's, for example, the colours of red and green in terms of icons, particularly people who are colourblind really struggle to read that information. Photography really helps reduce uncertainty, and the Cultural City website was very good at showing this what they call a social story, which I'll show in a sec, which essentially shows photographs sequentially getting from A to B, and it helps reduce the uncertainty aspect. The other thing, and I'm starting to do this so much more in my own work, is to use alt text in the imagery. From an accessibility perspective, most participants, I have to say, are much more digitally literate than I am, and they would use their phones a lot. And the photographs, to have alt text complete, improves their accessibility to the information. And so here's just an example, hopefully it's come out right, of a social story on Culture City's website where they show the sequences with just interesting using first person text of I went to, and then I went to explore, and there was this that I could go to, or I can touch this. So the other thing that came out that was very interesting was around mapping. So very mixed outcomes. Some people found Google Maps very useful, some don't. Some will not read road signs, etc., and wanted landmarks. Where toilets were and facilities was very important. We're putting that information in as well, because it helps then reduce uncertainty with it as well. I'm just speeding through this aspect because I'm just aware of time. So our upcoming work, so we've done the sound walks, we have advisory panel, I have them every month, which they've been a fantastic group in supporting this. They've created blogs, etc., on the website. We've had an online workshop. We have now on the 5th of June a in-person workshop on the website. We then have Festival of Nature Roundtable, which is more focused on professionals, developers, etc. in Bristol. And then we hope to launch on the 7th of July. Visit West will be launching the website. And that's just a bit of information about the upcoming workshop. And if anyone's interested to attend the roundtable at Festival of Nature, if you Google it, you'll get the information up. And that's going to be quite interesting. Also, just by chance, we got the Institute of Environmental, I can't remember what their last name is. They informed us that just by chance, this week's Noise Action Week. So I love things that happen serendipitously, but it is Noise and Action Week, and they do have some series of information and events. I think that are happening during this week. Thank you for listening. If you are interested, we do have a website with blog pages, etc. We try and create a blog every couple of weeks to record and map our progress, and they all have specific themes within them. The last two was one around law and planning and policy around noise pollution and quiet spaces, and then recently, I think I've been earlier this week. Blogs being published that was co-written with Jameson and Dan, who are in the call now, about noise pollution itself and being a bit more specific about the outcomes too. Finished. Woo!
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Sarah. That was very, very interesting and slightly different sort of presentation, but equally, there's a lot of food for thought because it breached to also other areas and areas that we work in. So this was really, thank you very much for the presentation. And I'll hand over to Julie for just to facilitate the Q&A.
Yes. Hi, everybody, and thanks so much, Sarah. There's one question here in the chat, well, two actually, from Caroline. First question is, how do you think Bristol City Council will use the information you provide to them, and will it impact planning decisions and policy? That's question number one.
Okay.
I'll leave you to answer that, and then we can go on to the other one.
So actually, Veronica Baraboldo, I never pronounce her surname right. She's
Barrow.
I'll get it. Well done, thank you, Dan. She's so she has written a blog specifically about this because unfortunately, right at the moment, there's voluntary policies that mean that they would influence potentially the local plan. But there are some other interesting links as well. So in Bristol, for example, if you are doing a major development, you have a health impact assessment, and noise is part of that health impact assessment. And recently also an evaluation of health noise is now being used in terms of that health evaluation. So from that as an evidence base, it would be really useful, and to see what comes from that would be great. I think I'm really happy that Bristol it's quite funny actually, I just emailed them and said, they've been aware of this project for a long time, by the way, this isn't new to them. But when we offered them the data, I was expecting having to go through a lot of approvals, but they were just like, no, you can have it next week if you want, we'll put it online. So I think there's very much an openness of receiving that information. How it's interpreted and take it forward, we'll wait and see. That a lot comes down to political driven aspects of it. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. And Caroline's second question is, how does predictability reduce stress? How does that manifest itself in a green space? So does that relate back to the visual journey available ahead of the visit, or is it a feature within the green space itself?
That's really that's a good question.
That's a well thought out question.
So I think, well, I'll take this part a bit more. So predictability from our participants' perspective, predictability means that there is not so many unknowns. And when things become unknown, that has a stress reaction. So to know that something's predictable, structured, or they know where something is, means that it's not an additional thing that they have to feel overwhelmed or think about too much. That is what we understand in terms of what they need. So, for example, when we were showing them various website examples of sensory mapping, etc., that was quite interesting, because although they wanted simple, they also wanted enough information there so that they can make an assessment and judge whether something is suitable for what they need at that time. Classic one is supermarkets. So whenever you go to a supermarket, for them, to know what aisle has what is really important. And if that changes, that can have a mass stress reaction, and that would prevent them from going to that particular place. So this is why things like the social story that Culture City produced, that's exactly why they have that social story of that journey to that point. I would say another thing, which I think is quite interesting that we're battling at the moment, I say battling, exploring, is that with a lot of green spaces, there's not that many identifiable features. So, for example, Weir Temple Church Gardens, you've got the ruin of the church, which is quite a great landmark indicator. But for some of the other green spaces, it's like, well, we can't really show just a tree. That's not immediately identifiable. So having, as much as a landscape architect, all these planting, isn't it great? But sometimes you need these clear, identifiable, unique structures to actually help people have a reference landmark point. So I think from a design perspective, it's quite an interesting one. Hopefully that helps.
Thank you. I don't know, Caroline, if you're there, if you wanted to follow up with any of that, or if there's anybody else with a question. You don't have to put it in the chat, by the way. You can raise your hand. You should be able to see it.
I am here, thank you. That does help to answer the question.
Excellent.
I think it's kind of, because also I was just thinking with like Temple Gardens, that's quite it's very well used at lunchtime, like it gets quite busy then. And would that then make it a sort of challenging space to be in? Do you have to start mapping times of the day? Like, I don't know. It's kind of it's an interesting one, isn't it, in a city centre, because it's the spaces vary so much, don't they, at different times?
So we can only go for like an average, a representative average. This project specifically is in the use between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m.
Okay.
So it's not evening use, because in terms of us, from an ethics side, we can only do during daytime hours. And it's something that actually is an important aspect in terms of, if we are focusing on those just daytime hours, what their experience would be. Now, obviously, there's variations and we can't predict what that is. There could even be events on that space, but the temporal aspects of times of day is important. But that's why it's important to also have more quiet spaces, and also to have a diversity of those different types of spaces. So, for example, Temple Church Garden, I know, hosts quite a few events and it's quite a popular place. But there are nuances within the green space itself. There are actual parts of that site that are quieter than other parts of the site that we are aware of and would be showing on the mapping. But that is something that people are going to have to make a judgment call on, because again, what people feel is quiet is subjective. So, for example, if you're in that space, one person may feel that, oh, this is really quiet and I can relax here, and others don't. There's other things that also counter that. We are aware that all of the green spaces were someone's favorite. But the Millennium Promenade definitely had the highest amount in terms of favorability. And that is because, I could go into a lot of, how much detail do you want me to give on this? But I think this is around the design aspect of it. When Millennium Promenade was designed, it was when building regulations had just come in and UKRI standard in terms of accessibility. And you can see they actively designed all those elements in. So there's tactile paving where there's supposed to be tactile paving. There is like specific design of benches that have X, Y, and Z and color contrasts. Also, just to talk about benches, Temple Church Garden, the benches are along the path, or they're in the middle of grassy space, the grass. The ones in the grass are inaccessible for anyone with mobility use. And the ones that are along the path, you feel like you're imposing with people walking through the path. So it's an interesting in terms of how people feel comfortable in that space. Well, the Millennium Promenade one, what they did is they created their own almost like personal pocket space off the actual path itself. It's perpendicular to the path rather than lining, so it gives that space. So I think that's why it's an interesting perspective, not only from a detailed side, but when you look at it from a wider perspective in terms of urban design and master planning, the alignment of roads, the heights of buildings, etc., and the materials on the buildings also have a direct implication about how quiet that space will be. The buildings become barriers. Georgian squares, for example, are quite an important designs in terms of the way that they stagger normally the entrance into a Georgian square. So that means that it dissipates the sound from surrounding areas. Not all, but quite a few. Berkeley Square, for example, top of Park Street is a classic case for that.
Thank you.
Can I just raise it, or just remind you of another point, actually, another bit of feedback we got from the sound walks from one of the participants on Temple Gardens specifically was saying, I normally come here at lunchtime and it's really busy. I've not been here at this time of day before, which was about 10 a.m, I think, 10:30. We did the walk and there's like, I'm going to have to start coming here earlier. So that temporal aspect is very important to people, and they were suddenly discovering it's a completely different place at a different time of day. And obviously accounting for that temporal variation in the mapping is something that's going to be very difficult to account for, but something that we are very keenly aware of.
Yeah, no, definitely. And also the journey to the spaces as well. There's a key component of that people forget, because like they think, oh, it's just about the space. Actually, the journey to that space is as important as the design of the space itself. So, yeah.
I was just going to say, there was a couple of questions, one from Katie, one from Fran, that are following up on what you've just been alluding to, Sarah, about using this information to inform the design of new spaces in the city. What do you think the potential is there?
I think it's a really I think there's already good design guidance about a lot of the changes that would be needed. Like, for example, the accessibility audit brought up that the former church, well, some of them are old cemeteries, some not, but the church gardens all had really poor surfaces. So for a lot of people, in terms of actually improving just the surfaces of the footpaths, would have a really positive impact. So, but that's already under various guidance and design improvements. It's a question of funds and leverage to change that. I think also Usurus, I can try and find and put a link in the chat. She has actually written a book which I contributed to for Bristol Sound Walks around specifically designing soundscapes. So just so you're aware, Wales, for example, has legislation around soundscapes, etc. Not the rest of the UK doesn't have the same legislation, but how do you design soundscapes is a really interesting component, because it's not just landscape architecture. You have to involve acousticians, engineers, architects, all sorts to actually develop these positive soundscapes. The nuances from the detail to the materials to the urban planning side is a very interesting one. And the guys on the call, Dan and Jameson, probably know a lot more than I do about this. But I'll put a link to her book, because it shows you not only how to design at endpoint, but all the way through a project stage as well.
Great, thank you. Zoe, you have your hand up.
Thanks. I was just going to comment on that insofar as there's something to be said about retrofitting some of the spaces that we know aren't quite accessible enough. So yes, taking these things into account for designing new spaces, But Bristol, as well as other cities, have spaces that are just not quite working well enough for everyone. So really taking that into consideration if the council's looking at how can we make things more accessible, get more people accessing green space. We know there's, mental and physical health benefits. Let's try to change those. The other thing I was going to say, Sarah already pointed out, these sites were chosen because they were central and not too far from either car parking spaces or a bus stop. I've also led sound walks over the last 10 years, some as a volunteer, some as part of other projects in some really quiet spaces, but reflecting on actually how people could potentially get to those spaces. They're not easy necessarily to access, even if you have a car. So thinking about, how can we get people to places? Are there public transport stops, bus stops, for example, located nearby? Again, really trying to integrate the way that we think about city design and city use.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Any other points anyone wanted to raise?
I think there's a point from Fran.
That was
informing design
yeah,
spaces.
a similar
Okay,
one
cool.
to the one earlier.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Just Sarah, from an academic point of view, you mentioned thematic analysis earlier on in the project planning and inception, I think. Could you just expand on that a little bit more?
So I'm just going to throw this wild thing out there. It's because I'm not really an academic. I had to, when I was putting this application, actually translate all the information for me. So like when I was asked, oh, what's the thematic approach analysis? I was like, I don't know what that means. So I actually had to go on Google and I was like, oh, I see it's using like qualitative research, identify analysis, patterns, meaning, etc. the data. And so when I started putting that together, I was like, oh, okay. So basically looking at all the data and where the themes are, etc. And so the reason why I've chosen things like, for example, the accessibility, mobility aspects, the heat vulnerability aspect, the aspects around, in terms of tree canopy cover, is that they are key aspects in terms of measurability of health indicators. And there's actually policies around these aspects. Like, for example, tree canopy cover is actually now a legislative policy for local authorities to achieve 16.5% cover. So I wanted to ensure that what we use has something that is actually embedded in either policy or is used widely in terms of an assessment in terms of health and well-being. And it's an important aspect when it also comes from when you're trying to produce the evidence database that's available as well. Because with a short project like this, I wanted to make sure that I can't reinvent the wheel. I have to use known data sets that are either open source or easily available, or that I have partners who can provide that information. So yeah, hopefully that covers most of the question.
That's great. Thank you.
Sorry,
Katerina,
can I just ask,
yeah.
I mean, it's really fascinating what you're doing in Bristol, but you said that one of the maybe sort of further steps would be whether that there is a methodology, an approach that could be followed by maybe other cities. So are there any maybe examples that the other cities in England or UK are doing similar works?
This is the first ever globally ever.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I keep on attaching the term pilot to everything, because there are sensory maps, quiet area maps, but nothing that's specifically focusing from a quiet audio perspective. So that's why this is quite different. What I'm trying to do is now simplify the process, not that it will lose the detail, but enough of a step-by-step framework of how we could widen it within Bristol, because we already are aware with discussions with participants. Oh, have you thought about this space? Actually, there's an area, a big shopping centre, Cabot Circus, and there's a very big desire to find quiet spaces that are within walking distance of Cabot Circus. Like there are other spaces that people have highlighted and said, oh, can we do this, etc. But they all need funding, because they are actually quite a bit of undertaking to assess. There is a process through it. But if we can reduce that process to something that is easier to define and replication can occur, then that's great. I know that with Antoinetta's research with Hush City, for example, she has lots of international connections as well as the connections within the UK. And it'd be great to extend it further to other cities, because obviously be interested to see where there are similarities and differences as well. You know, is it, oh, just in Bristol, this is a sort of thing that means something, but actually somewhere in Newcastle, there's a different requirement or meaning. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. And also it probably has got policy implications as well, because you would need to...
very much so, yeah. You know, Bristol has actually some quite strong local policy requirements that not all councils will have, but there's still national policies and other aspects that are applicable to those different areas. But I think, as always, it's what have value to that city or place or people as well. So yeah, I can imagine if it's the problem with at the moment, a lot of the data sets that we have on our noise mapping are computer generated. So this is much more nuanced and detailed about those specific spaces that you wouldn't necessarily find in computer mapping. But one of the questions would be, if we extended it and expanded it, could it be something that becomes easier to map and ascertain within smaller green spaces?
Great, thank you. I don't think there are any other questions, Julie. So if anyone's got a burning question, we maybe have time for one last question, or if any of Sarah's colleagues from the project would like to come up with any last wise words, then this is the space. But if not, then yeah, thank you very much. It's been really, really inspiring and interesting presentation, and looking forward what comes out of it. And I hope it will be inspiring for other cities, you know, not only in the UK, but also maybe cross over to other cities in Europe, that this work might be really, really relevant. So thank you very much, Sarah, for your time and for the presentation. And yeah, thank you very much for all of you to attend. And might see you in other CCRI seminars. Thank you very much, and bye.
Bye.
Thank you.